Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show. We have a special guest with us, the founder of the Zeitgeist Movement and author of this new book, The New Human Rights Movement. It's Peter Joseph is with us. Say hello to Peter Joseph. Hi, Peter.
Hey, how you doing there, Jimmy?
Now, first of all, I read this book. I'm not a good reader, so I probably missed a lot of stuff. It is a great book, and for me, what I took away from it, you really examine capitalism and the effects of capitalism on people, on societies, and people's psyches, and there was so many mind-blowing things in this book. I don't even know where to start. So let me just ask you, Peter. You could maybe tell people what this book is about and summarize it for them.
All right, sure. So the new human rights movement. How dare I? Mm-hmm. What is the old human rights movement?
Yeah.
The focus being we have to take a kind of a broader sociological, structural view of society to think about all the interplays that produce human behavior, that produce our social systems, our institutions more so. Like what has fomented all of this? How have we gotten here? And that is a public health debate. That is an issue of what defines public health, what defines actually, progress as we know it has to be defined in terms of actual health regards, not necessarily what we're producing in society, not how much productivity we have or the extent of GDP or how many people are employed, but how happy are we? And this is the core of it as a public health treatment. And I put it in the context of human rights because I feel that when people realize that we have a structural problem, and when I use that word structural, I mean that there's larger order things that are happening that influence our behavior, just as there are biological things that influence our behavior. So structuralism, sociology, effectively it's an interdisciplinary kind of study, which means you have to take a lot into account to figure out what the hell is going on in the world. And that's really what this is about at its very core, is that approach. And what I conclude in the text is that with this old economy that we have, you can call it market system, you can call it capitalism. I think of it more broadly. I say it's an economy run by market forces. That more gets to the point of it. Market forces embodies all the motivations people have. It generates the infrastructure, so to speak, the procedural dynamics, all the things we have to do to game in this reality, to survive. And then you have all these people, suddenly 7 billion of us, pulling levers on a giant machine. And we're not paying attention to what this machine's actually doing. We're getting our little treats and we're throwing it in our mouth and our little stupid rewards, and we keep going in our short-term interest, and yet this machine is a big train that's flying straight off of a cliff into oblivion. And until we get our heads around that, we're going to have a serious public health crisis in terms of socioeconomic inequality, one of the most destructive forces on the face of the earth, shattering human trust, social capital, they call it. We don't trust each other anymore. We have disparate groups that are going out of control. We have a whole new level of insurgencies and terrorism. The United States, of course, is the forbidden example of all of this. I call it the forbidden experiment, I should say. Sort of like when you lock a kid in a closet and you don't look at them for 10 years, and they come out and they're all deranged with this kind of primalness. That's the way I see the United States experiment at this point, because look at the violence. Look at everything that we're doing. Look how weird the culture has become. Look at the political system. It's become this amalgamation of so many things that, in my mind, is indicative of the worst outcomes, the most predictable, but yet worst peak outcomes of the kind of social system we have, the capitalist market force-driven system. So that, in combination with the ecological crisis, again, those levers that we're pulling on the machine.
So let me just stop you at the market forces.
Sure, yeah.
So your critique is talking about that this quote-unquote free market system, first of all, isn't a free market system, that it's really manipulated by the people with the most money, which means they're the most powerful, that manipulate a free market into their favor. Correct? Would that be correct?
As would be expected. So here's one differentiation that I want to make. So a lot of people will say this debate, they'll bring up this debate, well, if we could only have a more robust free market, if we could stop the crony capitalism, if we could stop all of the apparent things that are anomalous, but they're not anomalous. They're part of a competitive gaming strategy of group versus group. And capitalism is the embodiment of that primitive behavior coming from, again, eons of evolution of our most core and base instincts of, keeping your tribalism together and not caring about the external. And it's that very problem that in our high-tech society is, again, flying us off of the cliff. So go back to your point. What we have in terms of the free market, everything you see around you, this is it. This is the free market. It's the free market that buys politicians just like you buy pizza. It's the free market that takes and gouges people in the medical community to get as much as they possibly can to extract for the self-interest of one group or corporation. It's the free market that lobbies, that does everything that you consider to be unethical, but within the game of competition, there really aren't any lines anymore. I mean, it just depends on what corner you're backed into.
And so, so now why is it that some places institute a form of free markets or capitalism, say like Denmark, which they have a very strong social safety net, and they're now the happiest country in the world, I'm pretty sure, or one of the top.
Finland and Denmark, yeah. Both
okay.
Of them, yeah.
And they have less income inequality than we have here. So why does it seem that our version of capitalism in the United States is so much more brutal than places like Denmark?
First of all, I'm glad you bring that up, because that goes back to the democratic socialist policies and like Bernie Sanders and the very simple public health issues that he's brought up in terms of comparing our society and what we can do in terms of increasing public health and say, yes, it can be done. It's already been done in these countries. And that is absolutely important information that everyone listening should look into, because it proves when you look at the happiness indexes, when you look at the way they go about their lives, their public health metrics, they are doing so much better than we are. And that is amazing information. Now, why can't we just superimpose that type of capitalism upon the United States?
Right.
It's a great question. The difference is that we live in a global society, and the fleeting middle class of the United States is like the fleeting middle class of Denmark and Finland, and the Gini coefficients are still rising amongst all of these countries as well, as more stress on the planet, the more social stress, the more tensions between nations increases. So my point here is that you can't just look at the United States as some isolated bubble and then look at Finland as an isolated bubble and say that this policy should just be implanted here without regard to the evolution of all the countries, the colonization that has produced the landscapes that we see, the borders that we see, without the globalization and the power of transnational corporations. Sweden might be a very happy country. One of its biggest exports are massive military war machines.
Yeah, it's funny, right?
So there's a synergy to all of this that, just like you drive, my analogy is you drive down the middle class in Los Angeles, oh, look at these people. There's a dentist, there's a doctor. These people are doing great. They like their jobs, they have their nice home, they have their family, the ideal American dream. But yet what's on the other side of that middle class neighborhood? Extreme slums and extreme wealth. And that's the way the world is. So that's why Finland and Denmark exist in the class middle ground that they do, because of all the extremes around them.
So you're, okay. Oh, I see what you're saying. So you look at them, they're like the middle class of the world,
exactly,
in a sense. Yeah. So you can't extract that. Oh, I see. So you look at it as one whole.
Now, that's not to discount the important information we learn from them. There's
right.
great that we should be looking at these countries to see what's working in terms of increasing public health and ecological stability, because some of these countries, and even in areas of Germany and so on, they're doing robust things to create more sustainability, but they still exist in pockets. And as long as the empires maintain themselves, as they do, China, the United States, Russia, their gravity, that what they actually do will continue to affect the entire planet, and the extremes of their behavior are going to make a lot of the stuff that's happening in these other smaller countries kind of moot, especially in terms of development of sustainability.
So let's start. Let's start with how I don't think people realize. I think people individually realize how tough they have it and how hard it is to tread water. And we can say things like GoFundMe's number one thing is to campaigns are for medical expenses. You have a great statistic. You have many great statistics that kind of are great examples of how bad things have gotten with our system, our economic system. And one of those things that I've been repeating ever since I read it was 63% of people in the United States can't afford a $1,000 emergency. Yeah. And so this is the richest country in the world, right? And the history in the world. Yeah. And yet 63% of its population is poor, can't afford a $1,000 emergency. 50% of people are poor or low income. 50% of all wage earners are $30,000 or less. So do you have any more of these great statistics to show how our system has failed?
I should have made a statistic list, but I mean, look at the debt. It's from a couple of years ago, but if I remember correctly, 43% of people live beyond their means every year.
In the United States?
Yeah, not because they're just greedy people that want their new TVs.
Right.
There's an element of social inclusion that's inherent to us as a species where, people want to be included in what the society as a whole is doing. So that's what to be poor really means. You're not included, right?
Right.
If we lived in Mexico, this is kind of an aside, but if we lived in a rural area of Mexico and everyone has great happiness indexes out there and they have good public health, but they're poor, but they don't know they're poor. It's like the public health research in Cuba. When they're isolated and they're not experiencing this massive wealth divide and the feeling of kind of marginalization because they don't have certain economic means or certain elements of inclusion. I mean, they can't go out and do this or that other rich people can do. This creates sickness when people experience that. And if you don't have that, and this gets to the heart of what it means to have relative poverty and why socioeconomic inequality is so destructive. So, if you go through epidemiological research, any peer review studies, just look at it. I encourage anyone to do this. Look at what economic inequality correlates to in countries that have the most of it. The United States, off the chart, violence.
So the correlation,
drug addiction.
It's you use the term precondition, that capitalism is a precondition for violence, murder. Could you explain it that way? I think.
Yeah, sure. From a public health standpoint, a precondition is something that comes before. So, precondition to getting a certain disease, to have exposure to certain things, so to speak. You could also say precondition to driving cars, to get a license, and so on. But the point being is, if you have a certain foundation in your society that you can correlate to, which has been statistically done, to numerous outcomes, then that state becomes a precondition, predictably so. And, I didn't explain that very well. Precondition to getting, here's a better example, getting cancer would be to smoke cigarettes. So not everybody who gets cancer smokes lung cancer. Not everybody who smokes cigarettes gets cancer, I should say. But there's a statistical probability that people that are involved in that exposure are going to have that problem. And that's where we are with say, the American zeitgeist, as it were. So a good percentage of the population is going to turn into really hideous materialists, or is going to become more authoritarian, since it's in the rise of Trump, or is going to condone really brute policies in the Middle East and all of this, again, this exceptionalism in America. So the idea of a precondition means something that comes before, and if you want to get rid of all those caustic outcomes, you get rid of the precondition. And that's my whole argument in the book, is we have to do something different with our economy. It is the foundation of everything. The Neolithic Revolution happened 12,000 years ago. It set the stage for agriculture, settlement, cities, trade, exchange, labor specialization. Suddenly, the entire architecture of what we know as our market economy was built from that point on. And we've been in this disputed groupistic, in-group, out-group, warring machine ever since. Now, keep in mind, before that, 99% of human history, no money or markets, lived egalitarian. So anyone that gives you that human nature argument, humans are just mean, the whole Western philosophy, from John Locke to Adam Smith to any of those folks, they all look at, to Thomas Malthus, of course, they all look at human society as this mean, cruel thing, that we are just these beasts, and that this is the way it is. But that is absolutely debunked by the historical record.
So another way of saying that is people who advocate for selfishness.
Yeah.
Right? Correct? And you make that point in the book that that's not actually a good way to form an economic system based on self-interest, right?
I would say that because of the determinism that happened when we created agriculture, we created this warring machine that before that time didn't actually exist. I'm trying to put this in terms that are very
So there was a time when human beings were hunter-gatherers.
Yes.
And then they made the switch to agriculture.
Yes. And that set the stage for all the I'd call it geographical determinism, which is, I hate to sound technical, but ultimately what it means is that you have all the characteristics that you define of our, so we have property rights in our society. Obviously, if you do something, you want to protect it. Someone else might steal it that doesn't have the resource. You have security issues, obviously, similar to property rights. You have capital, which is that engine of creation that's done mostly through money, but also relates to labor and so on. And all of that was codified at that period of time. I want to make sure this point is very clear. I apologize if I'm going to explain it very well. We are on the trajectory we are because of the agricultural revolution. And we have to get out of this trajectory and reorganize our economy if we expect there to be any kind of harmony on this planet, and if we expect to maintain ecological stability or homeostasis with the habitat. This is where we are at this point in time. And how we organize that is going to be the defining feature of the next century. Because as of right now, not to jump to the end here, but I just want to make this point before I forget, with the advent of the pollution crisis, with everything that's happening in terms of resource overshoot, biodiversity loss, about 30 years from now, the refugee crisis is going to go from 65 million to probably about 200 million as the climate change starts to dry out more regions in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia, while the other lush regions start to flood because of the rise of the ocean. So what is that going to mean? All of our ponderances of democracy and so on become rather moot when the Western society in Europe is going to have an influx of people from these regions that have nowhere else to go.
And this is because of climate change, getting not only the encroachment of the sea, but the reduction in topsoil, correct?
There's a whole litany of things, and I want to point out it's not because of those things. It's because we have an economic system that has absolutely no regard for any balance with the environment.
Our next live Jimmy Dore show is July 1st in Portland, Oregon. There's a link for tickets for all of our live shows right there. And if you can remember, please take a moment to make sure you're subscribed to the show. It only takes a second. You probably think you're subscribed, but you probably aren't. Just make sure you're subscribed. Click that bell so they send you a notice when we drop a video. Otherwise, they won't tell you. And if you become a premium member or a Patreon, we give you hours of bonus material every week. And we do a live chat every Saturday at 2 p.m. Pacific time where you can ask us questions and we'll answer them. Plus, we're on Steam It. We're steaming it right now.